As is tradition with anybody presenting from Microsoft, we use our avatar. That is me. Perhaps not at this moment in time, but maybe at 5:30 this evening. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank IBIS Capital for inviting us from Microsoft to come and talk to you this afternoon. Certainly for the next, hopefully not quite an hour, I think we're going to give you a bit of time back. What I'd like to do is talk about Microsoft's perspective in terms of really how technology is shaping the e-learning space. Some of the points I've got in here you have heard already, so a little bit of reinforcement, but that's not a bad thing. We've got a number of companies here talking to you today. It's always good to know that we're joined up. I think that's a good thing. It would be rude not to introduce Microsoft in education, so I'm going to indulge in just a little bit of background and some of the things that Microsoft does in the education space, particularly around our vision and strategy. I want you to understand that because often I think a bit like what Juan from Pearson talks about, perception is not always reality. I'm hoping I can inspire you with some of the points in here and leave you with some provocative thoughts that will shape your thinking as you sort of go back and think about business and where you're going to invest and the opportunities perhaps that are now alive and well in the education space. So with that, I'll move on. So first and foremost, if you've seen an education presentation, this is hopefully something you might have seen. If not, this is essentially how we sum up our vision and mission within education. Now, it's a worldwide vision. It's not just UK. Anytime, anywhere, learning for all, fairly simple to say. Peel it back, and it's a little bit harder to deliver. What do we mean by this? From our perspective, this is somewhere between 6 and 7 billion people on the planet today. And each and every one of those has a right to an education. Education is not a privilege. It is something that we have an obligation to make sure that happens. I think we've heard a lot today about the future of education and the prosperity, particularly of young people, that need to develop the skills of the world of work for both today and tomorrow. And I think that's going to be a sort of an echoing and a repeating theme, certainly as I go through material I have. And it certainly powers our mission to try and be a valid contributor in this particular space. I think the other aspect to this is that, when we do think about 6 to 7 billion people on the planet, accessibility to technology is also part of that, both from an affordability point of view and both from an infrastructure perspective. And Microsoft doesn't do all of those things, contrary to perhaps some of the perception that we may try. And certainly in my role, I certainly enjoy the ability to work with partners, publishers, educationalists and whoever that can help us actually realize this vision. So hopefully it just gives you a little bit of context, really what makes Microsoft tick and some of the things that we're passionate about. Now, I think we've touched on this one already, and what I wanted to do was to really emphasize some of the skills impact, particularly from the technology industry's perspective. Now, this is something that's very close to home from Microsoft, so I'm hoping these examples really sort of bring it home. Now, if we look across the partner industry, particularly the partners that I work with in the UK, we have something in the region of 30 to 33,000 companies that we partner with in some shape or fashion. Now, across that ecosystem, there's around about 400,000 jobs per se, and roughly half of those are in the technology space or technology-specific roles. 1 in 4 of those jobs is going unfilled right now. 50,000 vacancies, and they're unable to fill them because there's a lack of skills in the market, a lack of new blood coming through that can help these companies move into the next space. And we're seeing this right across the board. We've got to try and figure out, everyone in this room really, I think I've heard this before, we have an obligation to try and fix this. Now, a stat that you've seen already, I won't repeat the second one, but if we do take the jobs that are out there today, technology in some shape or fashion actually plays a role for 50% of those jobs. Over the next 10 years, that will be 3/4 or more of those jobs will require the capability to use technology as part of that environment, okay, to deliver that work. Now, that's really important because that really informs us in terms of what it means to have skills as opposed to understanding technology, and there is a difference. And I'm going to use a really crude example to sort of try and illustrate this. So how many people recognize this? And if you want to put your hand up and say that you learned all about technology using this device, then please go ahead. Who's going to admit that? Oh, there we go. I actually didn't. So this was before my time, but then I would be lying, I suppose. So the point being is, if you could imagine back in sort of the 90s that everybody graduated from school and all they knew about computing was how to use the BBC Micro, what would that mean for the industry at the time? What would that mean for the people in the room now? I think it's an interesting concept, quite a frightening one if you think about it. The real point I'm trying to make is that it's about skills, not technology. All right? What we wanted people to learn when the BBC Micros were there was critical thinking, the ability to think your way through a problem, solve that using programming techniques, apply those sort of skills and develop those skills so you can take that into the world of work in one shape or another, whether that's technology or whether that's in more commercial vocational areas. But hopefully you get the point. It is about skills, not necessarily the tools and technology that we're trying to actually develop here. So I'm going to share a few resources as we go along the way. Microsoft we partner with Cisco and Intel and the University of Melbourne on trying to understand how we can develop 21st century skills to help equip that next generation of workers out there. And indeed, even the current generation to re-equip as the market evolves. We all want to stay in the world of employment. And I'd encourage you, there's free resources. You could even participate if you're working with education institutions to share your stories around innovative teaching and learning for a 21st century world. Some really good resources up here. Anyway. Okay. So I'm going to shift tack now. So I'm going to really move on to talk about really the digital revolution. It's kind of getting into the meat and bones of really what I'm here to talk about, I suppose. I think everybody will be familiar with the concept and challenges around consumerization. I think there was in the opening session, I think what Charles came up with, there was something about the gap in investment, particularly in Europe, and the USA, about how technology has been invested in terms of e-learning. And I really want to point to that because in the education market, I think we're feeling it really fast. Okay, consumerization is something that's happening, probably faster there than in some other spaces. And he talks about the comparison with the commercial markets. And what is this doing? This is putting devices and technology into the hands of our students, our teachers that are in education. And what it's actually doing to them, maybe not necessarily, more in a subliminal way, I suppose, is kind of saying these are the experiences I enjoy outside of the classroom. And what I want is a similar experience when I'm learning, both when I'm inside the classroom and when I choose to learn outside the classroom. I don't want yesteryear's approach of using technology for teaching and learning. I want it my way. I think you heard Juan talk about personalization. I think this is a massive contributor. The device explosion and what's happening around consumerization is really changing that. But what does it mean in terms of devices? So your devices themselves certainly are going to cause a huge amount of disruption out there. The ability to actually serve content anytime, anywhere is going to become increasingly obtainable as we sort of go forward. 10 billion units by 2020, that's a lot of devices. I hope we haven't got 10 billion people on the planet by then. Maybe we will, I don't know. But that's quite a challenge, okay? That is absolutely quite a challenge. And I think we've all got to kind of figure out how we avoid, I think the analogy earlier was the buckets in the room, and it's kind of really creating a lot of buckets. But nevertheless, this is changing the landscape, and it's driving personalization of learning. And it's really leading to concepts like bring your own device. I think we've heard about this, and I'm going to touch on this a couple of times. And it's kind of interesting, for bringing your own device to be successful, permission for your students to bring their own devices is not enough, although it is a start. And actually, I don't know if everybody agrees, but I'll throw it out there. I think certainly in schools, to a certain extent, that's what we've got today. I think we are seeing this beginning to happen, okay? In the universities, in higher education, it's a way of life, right? It's been like that for a long time. But, okay, now here's the big but. Devices never made anybody smarter. Right? This is really the point of the graphic here. No matter how smart the device is, you could still end up being this guy. And this isn't my stat. I can thank some of our fruity friends for this one. And the point being is that without embedded learning, without engagement, without actually looking at the way in which teaching and learning is applied to those things, those devices can sit in the corner, gather all the dust, and all there'll be is just a super browser and something for playing games in your own time. So there's a job to do here. And I guess really the point I'm trying to make here is it isn't just about the technology. We've heard about personalization. Personalization is really what is going to matter in order to drive student engagement, particularly around this world as we move into e-learning. I think one obviously summed it up with a number of examples in terms of that. I guess I would just add to the fact that with the given explosion of devices, my ability to choose where and when and how I like to consume things is really what we're getting at here. It's kind of have it my way, so to speak. And you can see this modeling in other areas. Think about catch-up TV. I think that's a really good scenario, a really mature scenario in the media space. How many people here have either got Xbox Plus or Sky Plus or whatever, and are using that to sort of look at TV when they choose to. But the impact of this, and this is the key thing for me, is that the role of the teacher, and arguably actually IT alongside the teacher, which is an interesting area, is fundamentally changing. And I've got an interesting kind of video shortly I'm going to show you that hopefully will illustrate that. It may seem a little bit detailed, but I think it gets the point across. Teachers at the moment stand at the front of the classroom. This analogy has been given already. They've got to be the guides on really what resources perhaps our students should be interacting with. So this is a massive change, and this is not just something that's going to happen overnight. It's cultural. So, and the last thing, I certainly think that we've heard this a few times already again, is that the digital revolution is really leading to additional insights, the ability to build positive intervention into an e-learning strategy. Assessment and big data and all these kinds of things are now potentially possible. I think there was some comments earlier to say that, yes, some of that data is there. Are we acting on it? Do we know about it? I think that's a fair comment. But we are underserving, but it's also a huge opportunity. I'll kind of talk about that again in a minute. So, show of hands, who's familiar with the concept called the flipped classroom? Right, it's pretty good. I kind of expected that. I'm going to indulge you in a little exercise and just explaining the flipped classroom. I just found this video. I just thought it was really good. So therefore, I put it in here. So this is the traditional classroom. I think we all recognize it. It was kind of called out a little bit earlier, but I'm going to slightly add to that dimension. So we've got the teacher at the front there. In this particular classroom, it's 3 students facing the front as usual, locked in like an airplane seat. The girl in the pink, actually, she is a really fantastic student. She knows it backwards. She could do this in her sleep. All right. Now, the interesting thing is that she's really bored because the teacher there is teaching to the middle, as they say. All right. She's having to distribute fairly evenly, not taking on board the different ability of those students in that classroom, and therefore a very able student is not being flexed. The boy in the orange, he's kind of the middle of the road. He's keeping up, he's enjoying it, he's fully occupied, and certainly not getting bored. The poor girl in the blue is really struggling, okay? Because fundamentally, the teacher isn't able to give her any time because she's up at the front and obviously delivering that teaching to the middle. Now, interestingly, when they go home, the situation just gets worse. The young lady in the pink does her homework in a matter of 5 minutes, is back out with her friends, and everybody's happy. The young lad in the orange obviously completes his homework as you'd expect, and the poor girl in the blue is completely lost, doesn't know who to call, and is in absolute misery and meltdown. Point being is that the teacher, again, would love to be able to individualize and spend time with these 3, but the mode of teaching here just doesn't permit this. Now, I'm going to play a video, hopefully. Yeah, here we go. So this just really illustrates really the concept of flipped classroom. And I know we kind of touched these concepts a little bit earlier, but I just think it does a great job in showing it. So here we are. We're now out of the class. We've got the 3 students at home. There's the chap in the orange. He's consuming the content, and he's playing the content, and he's accessing remote resources in the same way. These lessons have been pre-planned by that teacher. The girl in the pink is able to skip through things really fast, and because she gets it, right? She's on fire, as I said earlier. But the person in the middle who's struggling is able to pause, is able to do things at their pace and consume content the way they want to. All right? In addition, because they're actually utilizing collaboration tools that are in the cloud that allow them to connect with each other, they can socialize, they can share best practices and learning. It's a great way for students to help each other. And in fact, actually, we're developing a number of soft skills. So when the students are back in the class, right? The teacher is able to check in with them. It's more tutorial-based, it's more personal. I talk to the chap in the orange and he's fine. I give extra work to the young lady in the pink, and I'm able to spend more time with the lady in the blue because I know she's struggling. All right. Now, I will say that the concept in here doesn't necessarily take into consideration some of the analytics you might need around this, but it's certainly the possibility. And in the very last piece there, you see the teacher no longer being the piece in the middle, so to speak, between the knowledge and the student, but actually being the guide and actually the intermediary to make those things happen. Now, if you think about that, that is a major shift in terms of the behavior and the culture that we need to have in schools moving forwards. I'm not going to talk to all these points, but if you're looking at a BYOD strategy, particularly in a school, it isn't just about the technology. It's not just about reducing costs and flipping those budgets either to the parents or otherwise. It's all of these things. And I'd say the most important thing is really strong leadership, embracing BYOD in a teaching and learning policy, and making sure that there's professional development and resources for teachers to actually really understand this. Otherwise, if teaching in the classroom doesn't change and it looks exactly the same post the BYOD strategy, your BYOD strategy is wrong. Now, why am I saying this? One is that I think for people in the room, if we're going to look at providing services, whether it's in the e-learning space or perhaps some of the services that sit around this from a technology point of view, we've got to be aware of this. We've got to be mindful of this. Otherwise, BYOD or one-to-one really is what we're referring to here, will fail. Anyway, okay, so what about higher education? I mentioned earlier that BYOD and kind of one is a reality. Yeah, that's just the way that works. Bit of a plug here for the chaps at Pearson. So Michael Barber, Chief Education Advisor, as I understand it, worked with some colleagues to put together this paper. Avalanche is coming. Now, I put this in here because I think this is a really good read. Has anybody read this? So a few of you. And yeah, for me, I thought this was really, really good. But it raises a couple of points. So it certainly raises the introduction of these, and I'm not going to mention that because we all know what they are. Universities transforming, so global competition and choice. Now, this seems to be the main motivator for universities to jump on this bandwagon. And that actually is a bit of a concern, right? Because of all the things I just said, right? The whole point of flipped learning, the whole point of bringing these resources online and being able to reach, you know, a bigger and wider audience is to make that an engaging process. And if you haven't got teaching and learning at the heart of that, your experiences perhaps arguably are going to be flat. We need innovative teaching and learning. It mustn't be just about following. And this particular paper does a really good job in positioning this tension. This one's close to my own heart. My son's just about to go to university in September. Nothing like sharing a personal story. So I sat down with him on the DirectGov website and we filled in our student fees application form, you know, £9,000, plus the accommodation fees, 3.5 or whatever it is. So it's a lot of money, you know, a lot of cash. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the government is very happy to give me a £9,000 loan because, sure, my son is going to Manchester University. That's in the UK. That's a traditional degree. If we think about the world going forwards with the disruption perhaps around e-learning, what does that mean for government regulations? How will the funding mechanisms change? Again, this paper does a really, really good job to highlight that. I just think this is very, very insightful, and we need to understand these things. Controversial, perhaps, I'm going to throw it out there. Assessment in the MOOC world, particularly, is underserved. It does not take on board the ability to actually certify and ratify people's skills and prepare them, potentially, for that work. There are a lot of stats of people signing up and actually enrolling into MOOC-based platforms, and a huge dropout rate as they progress through. So I think that's an issue, but it's also an opportunity. So the question is, will MOOCs happen, or will it happen? And I kind of throw this out there because I think it just does a really good example to kind of illustrate the point. Some of us will remember the rise of Napster and really what happened with the music industry when perhaps they tried to resist the phenomenon and disruption that was taking place at that time. Now, I'm not saying what's happening with e-learning is exactly the same, but I think there are some parallels. There are some traditional parts of the industry that absolutely want to protect their business models and the way that they do things today. Reality is, though, this is going to find a way, and that's perhaps a personal opinion, but I think history tells us that's what's going to happen. So what of today? So there will be a few cheap plugs from Microsoft. I hope you expect no less. But I put this up here because commodity technologies out there today really are enabling institutions to start looking at this. We provide our cloud collaboration platform free into education. Technology like Link allows you to do lesson planning, videoing, audio, and you can share those things all out to whether it's local institutions or remotely or distance learning. The platforms are able to cope with these things. And these are free to do. The market is changing. The technology companies are competing in this space. All right, so just highlighting the point that some of this is actually starting to be possible now. I think the growth of apps, we're not really talked about that much today. I think you've seen a few innovative apps. But I picked this one out. This is Stanford University's kind of little marketeer app. But in here, you can actually go and get course samples and bite-sized samples. And they're using this to actually obviously sell and promote the students to the university. These are really easy to do. They're really cheap to build. Okay? And the evolution of apps and devices that's driving that is making that a very easy way to reach the market. I put this in here because the next kind of segue is I'm going to talk a little bit about what Microsoft's doing around our own e-learning platforms, because we have a requirement to do that. And we did a survey really to try and understand with the stakeholders that we typically deal with that are needed to learn how to apply Microsoft technology, in their environments, etc. We need to be able to train them, and they are typically technical people, and we provide courses and such like for those people. But like everything, things are evolving, and they want different experiences. I just think there's a nice collection of kind of pieces in here that I think largely have been said today. But this concept of bite-sized information, that's absolutely vital. I think I read in a paper that unless you're Abraham Lincoln, apparently he could absorb something for hours on end and apply it with no problem. But obviously he actually had a bit of a condition that allowed him to do that. And most people actually aren't in that situation. So just bite-sized information, the attention deficit kind of economy, as you call it, is really important to the success of kind of e-learning opportunities. The other aspect is that don't just think about the learning. If we're thinking about students, they're really, really motivated by what they can take with them, what's going to give them a little differentiation when they're looking for that next job. If we look at some of the economies, particularly in Europe, the amount of unemployment of young people is horrendous. Okay, and what you're seeing at the moment is the knee-jerk reaction to that is just going back into education. So if this is going to help change that, then we've got to give them more than that. So we've talked about the use of gamification, the ability to recognize, and those sorts of things, and that gives you like a social element to it, and I think that's important for engagement. But we do need to give a little bit more than that allows them to differentiate that, so when they're applying for things like jobs and so forth. And just a few more. The gamification piece just mentioned that. The increased device choice, we've got to make sure that if we provide these experiences, we've got to cater for that. How do we deal with that? I think this is an interesting one. Exponential increase in content. Make it easier to find the solution. Twitter and Bing. It would be Bing, of course. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, and I think there was a really good example of this, and I do forget which presentation it was. They talked about going into a search engine and typing something in and really getting a random kind of experience in terms of what you're looking for. And that actually is, people are just going to give up if that's really all we've got to offer them. And really what we're saying was that the social media and the ability to push, these kinds of things is a possible way of tackling that. Now, I don't mean, I'm Microsoft, I'm going to offer virtual technology learning, I'm going to push that out on a Twitter feed and hopefully everybody gets it. That's one aspect of that. But we know the way in which the young people are using Twitter today, both to amplify, to socialize, to share, to create that viral effect. That's really what we're getting at here. And what will happen is that cream of the crop will rise to the top. This is the assertion we're making here. But clearly search has got to be better. And that's really the point I'm trying to get there. Right, okay. So some of these, as I say, some of these things you've seen, I'm hoping this little graphic might help for those who might be interested to know how big the market is in this particular space. So $107 billion, that's a fair amount. We've really heard about some of the business models, freemium through to obviously, paid walled gardens and everything in the middle. And we've really got, I suppose, I don't know if maturity was right, I must admit. I changed this. The original slide said buzz. I kind of felt that was a bit US, if you don't mind me saying. I think maturity is right. I mean, things like Khan Academy with 3.5 million users are good examples of really relatively mature platforms. And the traditional universities are right at the opposite end, really, really trying to figure out really how they do this. Another graphic, which I think is quite interesting, obviously just showing really some of the footfall and just really how successful some of these platforms have been, and some of the investment models that sit behind them. And I think the interesting thing is the investment. Largely speaking, this place of MOOCs, or I'm going to use another word, what do they call it? Open education resources. So that seems to be another term that's out there. The funding models are typically donation-based, and there's risk around that right now. And there are organisations in this space that have fallen by the wayside because of that model not actually sort of holding up. But that said, there's definitely opportunity, and we are seeing, obviously, investors obviously looking to actually back this. And this was already mentioned earlier around lynda.com and Pluralsight, both receiving hefty investments behind their organisations. So that's kind of giving you a bit of a backdrop. We've talked about skills, and kind of hopefully you can get a sense of, if you're doing all these things together, we might have a chance to deliver on this vision. So what I want to do now is just share with you some of the things we're doing in terms of how do we get the audience that we typically work with, IT professionals and developers and people like that, actually trained up. And this thing's evolving from our point of view. So we got a service called the Microsoft Virtual Academy, cloud-based service, and this is something that we instantiated in 2010. And essentially, really what this is, it's a fairly, it's a freemium-based service. I, as an IT pro or a developer, can come on here. I can select courses that I'm interested in, and I pretty much sit there and I consume these courses. I can get, elements of, recognition around completing those courses. And, this is, to be honest with you, served in 11 countries. We can serve up the content in here very cheaply and very effectively. And this has really worked well for us. That's a good experience. And some of the concepts like gamification and recognition are built in there as well. Now, in that short space of time, we have some in the region of 1.1 million registered users on this platform. You can read as well as I can in terms of the stats, in terms of the kind of footfall that we're actually getting. The interesting thing is the massive explosion in actually some of the developing markets. Yeah, and they're able to come on utilizing relatively low-cost mobile technology, and obviously again able to actually access these platforms. Phenomenal growth. But where's this going? So really, we're looking forward in much the same way as you've heard today. We're looking at the next chapter for this. Where is this going to evolve? And this is really what we call the Microsoft Learning Experiences. It's a new cloud platform, global platform, that will really take this to the next stage. And it's really embracing, I guess, many of the concepts that we talked about earlier. I want to have self-paced learning on my terms. I want to have some interaction, real interaction with the best teachers in the world in this particular space. Okay. And, I also want it to tie back to how this is going to help me, get a job in the market where I am, or perhaps in another market. Okay, it's really important. And, of course, we're integrating, obviously, some of the social aspects and those sorts of things that we talked about around engagement. Now, what does that look like? There's some bold plans here. This is what we're looking to do over the next sort of 2 years, 2-3 years. First of all, it's all about the content delivery in terms of the technology training that we have out there today. We want to partner with additional organizations that perhaps see this as a low entry to market, and ultimately maybe even white label the service. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is in much the same way in cloud computing, you're seeing organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, dare I mention it, competing in this space. I think what we're talking about here, particularly in learning, and I have heard the word coined, learning as a service, you're going to see an awful lot of rush to the cloud to try and make this possible. And therefore, that means we need to think carefully about whether we're a company that's building infrastructure or whether we're a company that's actually building e-learning. So, okay. So we've kind of talked a lot about the concepts like flipped learning, skills, devices in this e-learning world. The last video I want to put up here, and I'm going to throw this word out there, and I'd love to get feedback on this, is ultimately the institutions where people learn today aren't going to go away, and I really do believe that. So whilst we think it's a sea change, I do believe and agree it's a sea change. When my son chose to go to Manchester University, he chose to go to Manchester University because we spent a couple of days up there, we looked around the city. The life experiences he will gain by spending 3 years of his life there is tremendous. That's got nothing to do with the degree. Clearly the degree is very important, clearly the learning experience is very important, but the life experience of attending that university institution is equally part of that. And we mustn't forget that. And the reason why I labour that point is because there is innovation both in and outside the classroom which we mustn't lose sight of. And I'm just going to literally play a short video to try and illustrate that. And there's just some number of technologies that have been developed under a program called the Microsoft Tech Fest, where they all come together once a year to kind of show off some crazy sort of ideas. But the point I'm trying to make here is that technology within the classroom actually is quite an interesting space to drive social skills, interaction, in-person interaction around innovative technology. The concept of driving engaging learning is very much alive in this space as well, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Okay, everyone's heard of natural user interfaces, augmented reality. These are obviously good examples of that. And this is just really trying to illustrate that we mustn't lose sight of the potential opportunity to both innovate in and outside to drive e-learning. I'll just let you watch that, and my voice is beginning to go. We're almost there. I think the other interesting aspect is some of the examples around big data mining, splicing, and using visual techniques to illustrate that really quickly. Yeah, I just think there's some fascinating things in there. And an interesting thing around research projects, and Microsoft's not the only one. You saw the lab work stuff earlier. A lot of these things are being made available for organizations to participate in and provide feedback and hopefully help us moving forwards. So just to summarize then, I think we've heard about this, skill shortages for the 21st century employed, massively important and should be a fundamental baseline that we should be making sure that we get over. Technology is actually a fundamental part of learning. It isn't just a side piece or a piece that you actually teach in its own right. It's actually part of the learning experience, and we've got to get with that. We have an opportunity to do that. Teachers and IT roles are changing. The flipped learning concept, okay? Talked a lot about that today with MOOCs and things. And just to say about the IT role changing, it is. The IT role traditionally is sitting in there resetting passwords and building laptops in the server room. That has to change. IT's got to get out alongside the teacher community to make sure teaching is working on the front line. We've got a big, big challenge ahead of us. There's a lot to happen in this industry. Digital gives us new insight. You're going to hear about that in the next session, so I won't steal the thunder on that. But point being is we actually can learn how students learn. That helps us to keep them on the right track and hopefully drive positive intervention. Clearly, digitalization of education will result in a 15-fold growth for e-learning market over the next decade. I'm not going to argue with that because that's the headline for today. And from our perspective, we see things like MLX doing that. And BYOD certainly is a reality. And whether we like it or not, devices is something we've got to kind of cope with in one way or another. And finally, as I mentioned with the closing video, let's not lose sight of the opportunity for innovation in the classroom. It's still an important place. And just leave you with that. I just thought this was a nice little quote. We do not need magic to change the world. We carry all the power needed inside ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better. And I think that kind of says it all. With that, I'd like to thank you. I think